A Separate Peace, Chapter 6. Peace had deserted Devon. Although not in the look of the campus and village, they retained much of their dreaming summer calm. Fall had barely touched the full splendor of the trees, and during the height of the day the sun briefly regained its summertime power. In the air there was only an edge of coolness to imply the coming winter, but all had been caught up like the first fallen leaves by a new energetic wind. The summer session, a few dozen boys began being forced-fed education, a stopgag while most of the masters were away, and most of the traditions stored against sultriness. The summer session was over. It had been the school's first, but this was its 163rd winter session, and for the forces that reassembled, for it scattered the easygoing summer spirit like so many fallen leaves. The masters were in their places for the first chapel, seated in stalls in front and at the right of angles to us, suggesting by their worn expressions and careless postures that they had never been away at all. In the apse of the church sat their wives and children, the objects during the tedious winter months of our ceaseless ritual speculation. Why did he ever marry her? What in the world ever made her marry him? How could the two of them have ever produced those little monsters? The masters favored seersucker on the mid-first day. The wives broke out of their hats. 5 of the younger teachers were missing, gone into the war. Mr. Pike had come in his naval ensign's uniform. Some reflex must have survived midship school and brought him back to Devon for the day. His face was as mild and hopeless as ever, mourning above the snappy, rigid blouse. It gave him the air of an impostor. Continuity was the key tone. The same hymns were played, the same sermon given, the same announcements made. There was one surprise. Maids had disappeared for the duration, a new phase then. But continuity was stressed, not beginning again, but continuing the education of young men according to the unbroken traditions of Devon. I knew, perhaps I alone knew, that this was false. Devon had slipped through their fingers during the warm overlooked months. The tradition had been broken and the standards let down, all rules forgotten. In those bright days of truancy, we had never thought of what we owed Devon as the sermon this opening day exhorted us to do. We had thought of ourselves and what Devon had owed us, and we had taken all of that and much more. Today's hymn was, "Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways." We had never heard that during the summer either. Ours had been a wayward gypsy music, leading us down all kinds of foolish gypsy ways unforgiven. I was glad of it. I had almost caught the rhyme of it, dancing, clicking, and a jangle of it during the summer. Still it had come to an end in the last long rays of daylight at the tree when Phineas fell. It was forced on me as I sat chilled through the chapel service that this probably vindicated the rules of Devon after all, the wintry Devon. If you broke the rules, then they broke you. That, I think, was the real point of the sermon on this first morning. After the service ended, we set out 700 strong, the regular winter throng of the Devon school, to hustle through our list of appointments. All classrooms were crowded, swarms were on crosswalks, and the dormitories were a noisy as factory. Every bulletin board was a forest of notices. We had been in an idiosyncratic leaderless band in the summer, undirected except by the eccentric notions of Phineas. Now the official class leaders of the politicians could be seen taking charge, assuming as a matter of course their control of these walks and fields which they belonged only to us. I had the same room which Phinney and I shared during the summer, but across the hall in a large suite where Leaper Lapierre had dreamed his way through July and August, amid the sunshine and the dust motes, and the windows through which the ivy had reached attentively into the room. Here Brinker Hadley had established his headquarters. Emissaries were already dropping in to confer with him. Leaper, luckless in his last year as all the others, had been moved to a room lost in an old building off somewhere in the trees towards the gym. After morning classes and lunch, I went across to see Brinker and started into the room and then stopped. Suddenly, I did not want to see the trays of snails which Leaper had passed the summer collecting, replacing by Brinker's flies. Not yet, although it was something to have this year's dominant student across the way. Ordinarily, he should have been a magnet for me, the center of all the excitement and influences in the class. Ordinarily, this would have been so if the summer, the gypsy's days, had not intervened. Now Brinker, with his steady wit and ceaseless plans, Brinker had nothing to offer in place of Leaper's dust motes and creepy ivy and snails. I didn't go in any case. I was late for my afternoon appointment. I never used to be late, but today I was, later than I had to be. I was supposed to report to the crew house down on the banks of the lower river. There are 2 rivers at Devon, divided by a small dam. On my way, I stopped on the footbridge which crosses the top of the dam, separating them, and looked upstream at the narrow little Devon River, sliding toward me between its thick fringe of pine and birch. As I had to do whatever, I glimpsed at this river, and I thought of Phineas, not of the tree in pain, but of the one of his favorite tricks. Phineas, in exhilaration, balancing on one foot on the prow of a canoe like a river of God, his raised arms invoking the air to support him, his face transfigured, his body a complex set of balances and compensations, each muscle aligned in perfection with all the others to maintain the supreme fantasy of achievement. His skin glowing from immersions, his whole body hanging between the river and the sky as though he had transcended gravity and might, by gently pushing upward with his foot, glide a little way higher and remain suspended in space, encompassing all the glory of the summer and offering it to the sky. Then an infinitesimal fearing of the canoe and the line of his body would break, and the soaring arms collapse up and shoot an uncontrollable leg, and Phineas would tumble into the water, roaring with rage. I stopped in the middle of the hurrying day to remember him like that, and then feeling refreshed when I went on to the crew house beside the Tidewater River below the dam. We never used this lower river, the Nagamasett, during the summer. It was ugly, saltine, fringed with marsh, mud, and seaweed. A few miles away it was joined to the ocean so that the movements were governed by unimaginable factors like the Gulf Stream, the polar ice cap, and the moon. It was nothing like the freshwater Devon above the dam where we had so much fun all summer. The Devon's course was determined by some familiar hills, a little inland. It rose among the highland farms and forests which we knew, passed at the end of its course through the school grounds, and then threw itself with little spectacle over a small waterfall beside the diving dam and into the turbid Nagamasett. The Devon school was astride these 2 rivers. At the crew house, Quakenbush, in the midst of some milling oarsmen, in the damp main room, spotted me the instant I came in, and with his dark, expressionless eyes, Quakenbush was the crew manager, and there was something wrong about him. I didn't know exactly what it was. In the throng of the winter terms at the Devon were at opposite extremities of the class, and to me there only came the disliked edge of Quakenbush's reputation. A clue to it was that his first name was never used. I didn't know what it was, and he had no nickname, not even an unfriendly one. Late Forrester, he said in his already matured voice. He was a firmly masculine type, which he was disliked only because he had matured before the rest of us. Yes, sorry, I got held up. The crew waits for no man. He didn't seem to think this was a funny thing to say. I did, and I had to chuckle. Well, if you think it's all a joke. I didn't say it was a joke. I've got to have some real help around here. This crew isn't going to win the New England Scholastics, or my name isn't Cliff Quakenbush. With that blank field, I took up my duties as assistant crew manager. There is no such position officially, but it sometimes came into existence through necessity and was the opposite of sinecure. It was all work and no advantages. The official assistant to the crew manager was a member of the class below, and the following year he could come into the senior managership with its rights and status. An assistant who was already a senior ranked nowhere. Since I had applied for such of a job, Quakenbush, who had known as little about me as I had about him, knew now. Get some towels, he said without looking at me and pointing at the door. How many? Who knows? Get some. As many as you can carry. That won't be too many. Jobs like mine were usually taken by boys with some physical disability, since everyone had to take part in sports, and this was all disabled boys could do. As I walked towards the door, I supposed that Quakenbush was studying me to see if he could detect a limp. But I knew his flat black eyes would never detect my trouble. Quakenbush felt mellower by the end of the afternoon as we stood on the float in front of the crew house gathering up the towels. You never rowed, did you? He opened up the conversation like that, without a pause or a question mark. His voice sounded almost too mature, as though he were putting it on a little. He sounded as though he were speaking through a tube. No, I never did. I rowed on the light crew for 2 years. He had a tough Batman body, easily detected under the tight sweatshirt he wore. I wrestle in the summer, he went on. What are you doing in the winter? I don't know. Manage something else. You're a senior, aren't you? He knew I was a senior. Yeah. Starting a little late to manage teams, aren't you? I am. Right you are. He put indigent conviction into me, and this pouncing onto the first spring of assertiveness in me. Well, it doesn't matter. Yes, it does. I think it does. Go to hell, Forrester. Who the hell are you anyway? I turned with an inward groan to look at him. Quakenbush wasn't going to let me just do the work for him like the automation I wished to be. We were going to have to be pitted against each other. It was easy enough now to see why, for Quakenbush had been so systematically disliked since he first set foot in Devon School, with careless disinterest, insults coming at him from the beginning, and voting for and applauding the class leaders through years of attaining nothing he wanted for himself. I didn't want to add to his humiliations. I even sympathized with his trembling, goaded egotism he could no longer contain. The furious arrogance which sprang out now at the mere hint of opposition from someone he had last found, from whom he could consider inferior to himself. I realized that all of this explained him, and it wasn't in the words in which he said it angered me. It was only that he was so ignorant that he knew nothing of the gypsy summer, nothing of the loss I was fighting to endure of the skylarks and the splashes and the pedal-bearing breezes. He had not seen Leaper Snails or the charter of the Super Suicide Society. He had shared nothing, he knew nothing, and felt nothing, as Phineas had done. You, Quakenbush, don't know anything about who I am that launched me, and I had to go on and say, or anything else. Listen, you maimed son of a... I hit him hard across the face. I didn't know why for an instant. It was almost as though I were maimed. Then the realization that there was someone who flashed over me. Quakenbush had clamped his arm in some kind of tight, wrestling grip around my neck, and I was glad in this moment not to be a cripple. I reached over and grasped the back of his sweatshirt, wrenched it, and came away in my hand. I tried to throw him off, and he lunged at the same time, and we catapulted into the water. The dousing extinguished Quakenbush's rage, and he let go of me. I scrambled back onto the float, still seared by what he had said. The next time you call anybody maimed, I bit off the words harshly so he would understand all of them. You better make sure they are first. Get out of here, Forrester, he said bitterly from the water. You are not wanted around here, Forrester. Get out of here. I fought that battle, the first skirmish of a long campaign for Finney, until the back of my hand cracked against Quakenbush's face. I had never pictured myself in the role of Finney's defender, and I didn't suppose that he would have thanked me for it now. He was too loyal to anything connected with himself. His roommate, his dormitory, his class, his school, outwardly and vastly expanded circles of loyalty, until I couldn't imagine who would be excluded. But it didn't feel exactly as though I had done it for Phineas. It felt as though I had done it for myself. If I had so little profit to show as I straggled back towards the dormitory, dripping wet with the job I wanted gone, temper gone, mind circling over and over through the whole soured afternoon. I knew now that it was fall, all right. I could feel it pressing calmly against my wet clothes, an unfriendly, discomforting breath in the air, an edge of wintry chill, an air that shriveled, soon to put out the lights on the countryside. One of my legs wouldn't stop trembling from the cold or anger, I couldn't tell. I wished I had hit him harder. Someone was coming toward me along the bent, broken lane which led to the dormitory. A lane out of the old London ancient houses on either side, leaning as though soon to tumble into it. Cobblestones heaving underfoot like a bridge over ocean squall, a great figure heightened advanced down toward me. It could only be Mr. Loudsbury. No one else could pass over these stones with such contempt for the idea of tripping. The houses on either side were inhabited by I didn't know who. Wipsy, fragile old ladies seemed most likely. I couldn't duck into one of them. There were angles and bumps and bends everywhere, but none big enough to conceal me. Mr. Loudsbury loomed on like a high-masted clipper ship in this rocking passage, and I tried to go stealthily behind him on my watery, squeaky sneakers. Just one moment, Forrester, if you please. Mr. Loudsbury's voice was bass, British, and his Adam's apple seemed to move so much as his mouth when he spoke. He had been there in a cloudburst in your part of town. No, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I fell into the river. I apologized by instinct to him for this mishap, which discomforted only me. And could you tell me how and why you fell into the river? I slipped, yes. After a pause, he went on. I think you have slipped in any number of ways since last year. I understand, for example, that there was a gaming in my dormitory this summer while you were living there. He was in charge of the dormitory. One of the dispensants of those days' deliverance, I realize now, had been his absence. Gaming? What kind of gaming, sir? Cards, dice? He shook his long hand dismingling. I didn't inquire. It didn't matter. There won't be any more of it. I don't know who that would have been. Nights of blackjack and poker and unpredictable games invented by Phineas rose up in my mind. The back room of Leaper's suit. A lamp hung with a blanket so that only a small blazing circle of light fell sharply amid the surrounding darkness. Phineas, losing even in those games, he invented better ways for what should win, and for what would have been the most brilliant successes of all, if only the cards hadn't betrayed him. Finney finally betting his icebox and losing it. That contraption to me. I thought of it because Mr. Ludsberry was just then saying, and while I'm putting back the dormitory together, I'd better tell you to get rid of that leaking icebox. Nothing like that is ever permitted in the dormitory, of course. I noticed that everything went straight to the seed during the summer, and that none of you old boys knew who our standards so much as lifted a finger to help Mr. Prudhomme maintain order. As a substitute for the summer, he couldn't have been expected to know everything there was to know at once. You old boys simply took advantage of the situation. I stood there shaking in my wet sneakers. If only I had truly taken advantage of the situation, seized and held and prized the multitudes of advantages the summer offered me. If only I had. I said nothing. On my face I registered the bleak look of a defendant who knows the court will never be swayed by all the favorable evidence he has. It was a schoolboy look. Mr. Ludsberry knew it well. There's a long-distance call for you, he continued, the throne of the judge performing the disagreeable duty of telling the defendant his rights. I've written the operator's number on the pad beside the telephone in my study. You may go in and call. Thank you very much, sir. He sailed on down with the lane without further reference to me, and I wondered who was sick at home. But when I reached his study, low ceiling glooming with books and leather black chairs, a pipe rack frayed a brown rug, a room which students rarely entered except for a reprimand, I saw on the pad not the operator's number, but from my hometown, but one which seemed to interrupt the beating of my heart. I called this operator and listened in wonder while she went through her routine as though this were just any long-distance call, and then her voice left the line, and it was pre-emptied and charged by the voice of Phineas. Happy first day of the new academic year. Thanks a lot. It's A, you sound. I'm glad to hear you. Stop sputtering. I'm paying for this. Who you in a room with? Nobody. They didn't put anyone else in the room. Saving my place for me? Good old Devon. But anyways, you wouldn't have to let them put anyone else in there, would you? Friendliness, simply going out affection. That was all I could hear in his voice. No, of course not. I didn't think you would. Roommates are roommates, even if they do have an occasional fight. God, you were the crazy when you were here. I guess I was. I guessed I must have been. Completely over the falls, I wanted to be sure you'd recover, and that's why I called up. I knew that if you'd let them put anybody else in the room in my place, then you really were crazy. But you didn't. I knew you wouldn't. Well, I have to just trace of a doubt, but that was because you talk so crazy here. I have to admit, I had gone just a second when I wondered. I'm sorry about that, Jean. Naturally, I was completely wrong, and you didn't let them put anyone else in my spot. No, I didn't let them. I could shoot myself for thinking you might. I really knew you wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. And I spent my money on a long-distance call, all for nothing. Well, it's spent on you, too. So start talking, pal, and it better be good. Start off with sports. What are you going out for? Crew. Well, not exactly crew. Managing the crew. Assistant crew manager. Assistant crew manager? I don't think I've got the job. Assistant crew manager? I got in a fight this afternoon. Assistant crew manager? No voice could course with dumbfoundment like Finney's. You are crazy. Listen, Finney, I don't care about being a big man on the campus or anything. What? Much more clearly than anything in Mr. Loudsbury's study, I could see his face now, grimacing in wide, obsessed superfaction. Who said anything about whoever they are? Well, then, what are you so worked up for? Why do you want to manage a crew for? Why do you want to manage for? That's what I've got to do for sports. The point was, the grace of it was, that it had nothing to do with sports. for I wanted no more of sports. They were barred from me as though when Dr. Stanpool said sports are finished. He had been speaking of me. I didn't trust myself in them. I didn't trust anyone else. It was as though the football players were already bent on crushing the life out of each other, as though the boxers were in combat to death, and as though even a tennis ball might turn into a bullet. This didn't seem so completely crazy imagination in 1942, when jumping out of trees stood for abandoning a torpid ship. Later in the school swimming pool, we were given the second stage that in rehearsal, after you hit the water, you made a big splash with your hands to scatter the flaming oil, which would be on the surface. So to Phineas, I said, I'm too busy for sports, and he went into his incoherent groans and jumbles of words, and I thought of the issue was settled until at the end he said, Listen, pal, I can't play sports. You're going to play them for me. And I lost part of myself to him then, and a soaring sense of freedom revealed that this must have been my purpose from the first, to become part of Phineas.